Hello, can we all settle down? Uh, those of you who are at the back and standing, can you all just come ahead and sit, please? So, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second conversation of the Monsoon 26-27 cycle of C Conversations. I welcome everybody who's present here in person, as well as those who are joining us on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. I'm Rohit Muzumdar. I teach here at C. Let me take a few minutes to introduce C Conversations before I introduce today's specific lecture and our speaker over here. So, since its inception in 2014, C Conversations has brought together practitioners from a wide range of disciplines, including architecture, urbanism, planning, visual and performing arts, literature, engineering, social work, and many other disciplines. Um, in dialogue with students, faculty, and the public at large. C Conversations has a twofold aim. First, C Conversations is a platform for fostering critical dialogue on space and society. It engages audiences both within and beyond C. Second, this dialogue is multidisciplinary in the sense that we invite not only architects, but also practitioners and academics from other disciplines to expand the horizons of architectural thinking here at C. It's a platform that fertilizes conversations across disciplines. And it is through this public engagement, it becomes one of the ways in which C Conversation advances Society of Environment and Architecture's outreach commitment to contribute to the creation of more just worlds and the creative thinking that is required to advance them. These C Conversations are partially supported by the Urban Center Mumbai, and they are free and open for public to access and participate in both in person and online. So as a form of practice, C Conversations have been curated by faculty at C. Over the last few years, we have organized and curated C Conversations around particular thematics that run through the whole year to develop a larger dialogue around a larger question. And it's not just that one is engaging just with one speaker and a conversation at the one moment, but through this extended dialogue over a year or over a semester, we are developing a body of knowledge through a series of conversations. And I think that is one of the important things about the way in which we conduct these conversations as public lectures, as public dialogues across a range of disciplines. So this conversation series, the 2026-27 conversation series, is titled Projections, Anticipation and Architecture, and it dwells into the role that anticipation plays in thinking about futures, thinking about spatial futures per se. For a long time, at least for a century, envisioning futures has been a central intellectual pursuit of the discipline of architecture. It is, so to speak, concerned with projecting new spatial possibilities, and imagining the worlds that we would like to inhabit. This is a central commitment of C's pedagogy, and it runs across the courses that we are engaged in and inquiring to explore at all across the 5 years in the undergraduate program. So whether one is exploring body and experience, type and space, whether one is exploring ontological explorations and institutions, inquiring into mass inhabitation or urban form, technological explorations, so on and so forth, they're all directed towards thinking about the possible future worlds that we want to create or co-create with people whom we are engaged in inquiring into. So that's a central kind of commitment of the pedagogical program at C. It's also a commitment of the research and diverse forms of artistic practice that takes place amongst the faculty members at C, as well as the trustees who are engaged in their own practices beyond teaching over here at C. So this is central commitment, or this is central aspect of pedagogical exploration at C. It is through these inquiries that we seek to understand not how the world is made, but also how the world could be made otherwise. And these inquiries, I'm sure, are inquiries beyond C into as their own long duty question. Researchers, academics, and practitioners will be invited to see to engage with them in these conversations. Anticipatory imagination, the aspect of anticipating the future, is neither neutral nor objective. It is always practice, shapes our engagements with time, space, lives, ecologies, and realities. It is an approach to think with and through a gathering of beings, diverse kinds of beings, both human and non-human, in time and space, to draw the path together and to ask whose lives matter and are held reach, even if continuously in the speculations of the gatherings of the future. So during the first half of the 20th century, architects positioned themselves and their disciplinary expertise as the purveyors of the future, the sole purveyors of the future. Over the second half of the 20th century, sustained critiques challenged this view that ideas of the practice of imagining future was the purview of architects alone, pluralizing the disciplinary forms of expertise engaged in the intellectual project, but also lay forms of knowledge that engaged similar kinds of practices. So the task of imagining and making futures came to be recognized and shared, negotiated beyond professional expertise. Yet today, cross disciplines, widespread anxieties about uncertain futures in the contemporary times that we are located are often dualistic. They project after catastrophe, and actions on the one, or they look at utopia as a response to the present. It is in this it is in this context of these dualistic imaginations that we are looking, and we intend to open up how can we move beyond dualistic states of engaging with intellectual pursuit of your future in the contemporary moment. And it is in this backdrop that these are what form of spatial thinking and what practices emerge when application is understood as a widely distributed and negotiated capacity in the turbulent worlds marked by difference, colliding, uneven
conditions of harmony and pervasive certainty. How do art and their architectural practices project prospective or retrospective from the social background, social conditions they are situated in their life? So the eight conversations that we will be doing during the months of conversation invite a researcher and a practitioner. Last, the first conversation, in the first conversation, we invited a to the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Today, uh, we have with us Aurgho Jyoti, the founder and director of Architecture, Urbanism and Research in architecture practice based in New Delhi and New York. Aurgho will speak on the production of in the design evaluation forces of migration and material. These dimensions are central to AUR's focuses on creating history, the crafting of the future, by constantly excavating histories of the past. So it is the relationship between the past and the future that becomes the central aspect of what uh, in framing this provocation, AR architecture is a responsibility and history as an instrument to facilitate cultural continuity, social integrity, and material specificity. They focus on knowing memory in through material practices and the means that architecture required exploration games. AUR's practice engaged a wide range in culture, wide range of social and institutional projects. They won several awards, including the AI Practice Award, the AI Long Term Architecture Award, and the India Humanitarian Hub Award. Arco, Arco is educated as an architect in Harvard, Cornell, and SPA, has worked in Pritzker Laureate, including SOM, OME, Gehry Technologies, and Studio Fuksas. His work has been executed at the Center for Architecture in New York, Seattle Architecture Foundation, Astoria Heritage Museum, Harvard University, Bedford, Williams
It is sort of heavy and robotic voice is
with
coming.
that brief introduction,
It's coming.
just the one that Woman and White to present his work following the hands. So the format of the conversation will be like this, or will give his talk followed by Apurva Talpade, who will be discussing in conversation with Aurgho. Apurva Talpade is a faculty member at School of Environment and Architecture. She is an architect, artist and illustrator in terms of her practice. She is the associate director of Sea Press and engages with several activities that Sea Press is in kind of coordinating and simulating activities that Sea Press is currently engaged in, as well as work on experience that she's currently engaged. So also Apurva. After all those, we have Apurva will have a conversation with followed by conversations. We open up conversation with the audience. So
Thank you, Rohit. Thank you for introduction. Rupali, thank you for letting me here. Prasad, great to meet you, Apurva, everyone. Before, do I scroll?
Is it normal team? It's better.
Before I start my presentation, I'd like to say that uh, thank you for having me here. And I would also say that to the students that you might not know how fortunate lucky you are to be in this place, to go through the background, review the classes that you're going to. So take it as an opportunity and not as a burden. Any studio exercise and everything that you're doing, because this one, what you're learning here is not happening in many places. So always embrace it and don't take it, things as a burden. I'll briefly introduce AUR and ourselves. So we have a practice between New York and New Delhi. The team primarily is in New Delhi. Our work, 75-80% of the work is also in India. And I live in New York and Delhi. I have my partner, Subrati, who's in Delhi, and we have an amazing course that's in Delhi, and we have a couple of people in New York. We have always focused on, uh, we started in engagement and we have always tried to focus on cultural and social projects. And I would share some of the work that we're doing that focuses on that agenda. Just a quick introduction. I would like to, at the very onset, I would like to foreground uh, the way we approach architecture, the way we see the practice of anyone signifies the other, the signals of God. The work aims for cultural significance and social relevance. The work intends to create meaning by the production of space for migration, material, and memory. We really think of architecture as a political act. Space gets created that contested through forces of migration, labor, climate, colonialism. And these are things that we don't write about. We try to initiate and work on projects that will directly relate to these forces that we're talking about. The work addresses traditional domains of science, context, and program through the dichotomies of the global worker and the urban rural condition. The work is grounded in anthropological interests in the sensorium and how people create and live through space, and in turn get conscious and subconscious. To summarize, we think of architecture as a responsibility, not as a service, and we look at history as an instrument. We are interested in architecture, material, and myth that crafts histories of the future or excavating histories of the past. We have been lucky enough to work with organizations like the World Bank, international NGOs in several UNESCO heritage sites across India. And we go over those projects and we also talk about the institutional work and social projects that we do. The practice focuses on the confluence of diagnosis and conviction. The diagnosis that beyond the social and environmental crises of the present moment, there persists a cultural crisis that receives insufficient attention. The collective and the erasure of shared memory. The conviction that architecture is among the most powerful instruments available for resisting that erasure. Providing continuity of memory is the recurring pursuit that organizes our work. That's our in Delhi. We are prey to some tropes of wearing black. We don't wear black every day, but it happens sometimes for a photo shoot. But we have an amazing team in Delhi that we are working on a lot of projects. We're working in 5 provinces across India. What I will focus on will be direction, material, and memory, the presentation, and will through try to highlight these aspects of migration, material, and memory through architecture projects. Although our name is as Urbanism Research in it, we are primarily an architecture practice that tries to with urbanism, with research, but at the end of the day, most of our projects are architectural projects. I'll start with the structure of the presentation. We'll start from the work that we do in the US. We'll do a short journey to China where we have done some proposals and previously working at China and worked on certain power internet. And then we'll move to India where the majority of the presentation will be focused. Um, but in the US, we have several residential projects, but there has been failed attempts at cultural projects. And in the light of those projects, I would like to start with an architectural dilemma. Uh, architectural, these are two projects, one in Berkeley, California, one in Bangkok, New York. One of them has been built, the other one is a work in progress. But what we want to talk about is this architectural dilemma of working on a technology that gets transferred geographically into a new context, and how do you respond in that context? Architectural representation of a place of worship can be the origins of religion. Form and meaning are intimately linked. The Vedanta Center in Berkeley was designed as a Spanish colonial church without being thoughtful of its specific spiritual form and its associated meanings. Glencoe Gurdwara, like many others in the US and Canada, appropriated an existing colonial building for the ease of time and use. The critical question is in religious typology geographically transferred, what can what should the typology become? Can more critically, what does an intervention in that context become? This is the Vedanta Society that was started by Vivekananda. On the right hand side, you see Vedur Bhatt, which is inside of California. On the left hand side is the Vedanta Center in Berkeley, California. Uh, the Bay Area, some of you know that the Bay Area was instrumental in the hippie movement of the 60s and 70s. And these Vedanta societies were instrumental in introducing yoga to the West, was also instrumental in influencing on Indian philosophy, became the core of Hindi culture. So you have these extremely divergent technologies where one is a mishmash of Mughal, Bengal, uh, historic elements. On the left hand side, it's a highly Spanish colonial church that was designed by British architects who was designing other colonial other Spanish churches in California in the 1800s. This was designed in 1920s. Um, the architect have, I don't know what is provided, but the architect didn't have exposure to the origin of the society in India. And what we see is appropriation of existing typology to become a place of worship or the business center. So the projects, the project was designing a diet for monks, and the dilemma was, do we provide an extension of this Spanish colonial church, or it back in India? These are the interiors of the church. To the left, if you see my cursor, is the original building, and there's a garden in on the right-hand side of the site. This is the empty adjacent plot where a new structure was added as an extension of the original structure without a physical extension that became the dining hall, where the two monks that reside there, along with the people who visit the Sunday gathering, they would have their lunch after the gathering. What we decided to do is address the site and the materiality of the site, work with the Spanish style, and add this
humble structure that is low at its very end, at the beginning, and then it rises up to the height of the tallest point of the church. These are some of the interior views. So what we decided was to use these Spanish tiles that are very prevalent in all over California. And most of the missions that are spread across California are built with these tiles. And we worked with them to create a form that sort of responds to the site. And that's the entrance. That's after, that's where the monks live. And that's a small lobby space. After your sermon, that happens in the main hall. You enter into the dining hall from this lobby-like space. So that's the interior of the space. We wanted to create a cathedral in the sort of the Western sense, but have humility of the structure that is there. I'll quickly talk about a project that we have been in conversation with the Gurdwara in Glen Cove, New York. They wanted to add a language school at the top of this old building from early 1800s. The interesting part about the project is they changed many hands. It used to be, this used to be known as the Gold Coast of New York. So it used to be the home of an affluent Wall Street banker. It converted it into a conference center, an event space. And finally, in 97 is when the Gurdwara bought this space and reappropriated the space into a Gurdwara. The top floor lies empty. That's where they wanted to add a school. Those are the plans of the building. What we tried to do in the proposal is, of course, have a very simplistic vaulted corridor that runs along and acts as the main spine. And from that corridor, you enter into the classrooms where these would be used for Punjabi language classes, where you would enter into the classes. And of course, there's a reference to the Golden Temple, although there's no marble here, but there's reference to white and gold. That's the entrance lobby with the lift. We are currently working on a project in Tribeca, Lower Manhattan, for a high-end Indian restaurant. Tribeca, for those of you who would know, it's a very historic neighborhood with a lot of historic buildings. And similarly, this building that we are working in is part of the historic, it's identified as a historic building. We are not allowed to do much with the exterior. The idea was to, the blue that you see in the interior and the lights, the color palette came from the client. What we tried to reinforce was to create a uniform blue interior with these lights hanging from the ceiling that would be visible from this corner. It's a corner plot. But what I would like to stress on is, in this context of doing a restaurant, we navigated working in a historic building. And that's fascinating because you scrape through layers of the building and you see multiple layers from 1800, a layer from 1900 as the building went through renovations. So that level of archaeology of an architectural site is very interesting for us. And we get to deal directly with archaeology in our work that we did in Sarnath or Lumbini, but in downtown, in Lower Manhattan, we deal with a different level of archaeology where we are trying to break open and exist and a historic building from the 1800s, and you sort of take apart the pieces that have made the building over the years, de-layer the building. That's the interior. There's a lot of brickwork that's already there. We are planning to stain all the brickwork with the indigo that is being used. So there's a uniformly applied indigo across the entire interior environment, from the walls to the ceiling to the floor and the furniture. We'll take a short detour into two projects in China. I would mainly like to focus on the later part of the presentation, which is our work in India. We started in December 2019, and our first project, of all places, was in Wuhan, China. Before we knew what Wuhan was, before we knew what was about to come with the COVID pandemic. We didn't have anything to do with it, but I was familiar with Wuhan because we worked, SOM used to work there on several projects, so I was quite familiar. Wuhan, in many ways, similar to Bombay and similar to Calcutta, had a lot of wetlands, and most of the wetlands were being filled in with construction. So our idea for the project was to create a wetland in the middle of the site. And then we worked on two parallel projects. Another project was both were technology campuses, so designing office buildings for technology companies in Wuhan. This is the Yellow Crane Tower, one of the 4 major towers in China. And to the right, you see a typical commercial street. Also, the eaves of the roofs and the form of the Yellow Crane Tower is something that influenced us as a cultural motif that we could take forward and work with in our design. I'm just giving very quick glimpses of the projects. This was the Wuhan, the first project where we worked with the gray bricks and gray terracotta cladding along with curtain wall. And the second project, we created these towers that were that had a simple folded plate system to create a motif that had an influence from the pagoda form that is prevalent in Wuhan from the Yellow Crane Tower. That's a street front that we had worked on. I'm going to quickly now move on to our work in India that is primarily the majority of the practice, and that's what we will focus on. We are going to talk about migration from the lens of two projects. One of our projects is under construction. It's a Port Heritage Museum in Kolkata that deals with the history of Kolkata Port Trust. And it also has a gallery on indenture labor. And we have been researching on indenture labor relationship between migration and labor for several years. And we brought all of that research into the project. And we also worked with a trust in Calcutta called the Kolkata Partition Museum Trust. We worked with 1947 Partition Archive to archive oral histories and exhibit them. They are based out of Berkeley and Delhi. So we have done some exhibitions on partition oral history projects, and we also designed a virtual museum and are in conversation with a potential client, a potential donor for a physical museum in Kolkata for partition. So that's Calcutta in early 1830s. Slavery was started in the 1500s or 1600s, depending on what sources you refer to. But the transatlantic slavery, the first slave ship docked in 1619 in Old Point Comfort, Virginia. And that went on for around 200 years. And in 1830, slavery was abolished in the British Empire. When slavery was abolished, we have all these plantations around the world that needed labor because people who were working as laborers, as slaves without pay, they were not slaves anymore. But and some of them chose to still work in the plantation for pay, and many of them chose to be free and do other things. So there was a huge shortage of labor, and the British Empire came up with an amazing plan to supply labor, primarily from India and also some of it from China. And some of the ships that you see are decommissioned slave ships, but there were many ships that were just built for the indenture trade. And Indians were from UP, current day UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, and Bengal. They were villages that were along the river, along the Hooghly River, along the Ganges. They were taken on boats for the promise of work to Calcutta, where they would dock for several days, and then they were put on ships without, you might have heard about the movie Kala Pani, black water. Anyone sailing out of the river into the sea was highly inauspicious. So that's the riverfront of the city in 1840s when indenture trade was starting out. There's an interesting, there's a lot of literature that has been written on indenture labor and migration, but I particularly like Khal Torabuli. He's a Mauritian writer. Migration, both voluntary and involuntary, creates multiple identities. In the indenture labor trade, there is a trilogy of identities: the laborer who lives in the village of India, the laborer who travels by boarding the ship, and the laborer who arrives to work at the plantation. Physical and mental cartographies are intertwined to create these multiple identities, where the relationship of the body and mind is constantly redefined within the multiplicity of space and time. The person who is inland is a different person. The person who travels on the ship is a different person. And the person arriving is a different person. The trilogy navigates from a terracentric, land-based conception to a thalassocentric, ocean-based, and one eventually terracentric. Amitav Ghosh, noted writer, he has spent a lot of his life writing the Ibis trilogies. For those of you who are interested in this, should read on Ibis trilogy, which talks about the indenture trade. It also talks about how the Indian Ocean world gets connected to Singapore, Malacca, Hong Kong, and by extension to Mauritius, South Africa, and then crossing the Atlantic to Central America, the West Indies. The journey, the ship in the context of indenture defines a contraction space of movement within the ocean with new definitions of social relations and power structures. The ocean was an unknown adventure of false promises. Indians are obsessed with the unknown of the sky, astronomy and astrology. Would-be laborers would watch stars. Khal Torabuli refers to them as sky marks and not landmarks over long periods of journey. Amidst the intense suffering and a small hope for a better life that was falsely promised, they could see the beauties of the sea. A lot of the work that you see goes into the museum that we are working on, and it's currently being built. I'll show some construction photos, but this is our work on the galleries, on the indenture gallery for the museum, where we mapped cartographies of indenture, essentially all the countries that laborers moved from, either Calcutta or from Chennai. And we are documenting them. We are documenting the ports where they moved to, in Mauritius, Reunion, South Africa, Fiji, and how each of these ports have changed over time over the last 150 years. I'm just throwing some snippets of what we have been working on. Suriname, Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica. And you see all of this, for those of you interested in cricket. You see Indian players in South Africa, in West Indies, but you should also, I'm talking to the students here, you should understand how history, colonization is not a thing of the past. We are living in it. So if you see an Indian player in West Indies or an Indian player as part of the South African team, it's because his grandfather's grandfather migrated as a laborer to South Africa. We studied the depot, the departure, and the arrival. And I think the depot was a very important emotional space. It was a liminal space because it was about the in-between. But it is the Middle Passage is used for the transatlantic slavery quite a bit, but it is also used for the indenture labor. People from different parts of northern India with different cooking habits, different religions and languages, different cosmogonies, waiting for coolie ships to come. It is a recreation of the world within the mainland of India. People mix before crossing the sea. The arrival depot is where hope and fear merged. The unknown new land they were to be part of. And mind you, like most of the places they were migrating to were marshy, were barely had any settlement. They were just fields of extraction where sugar would be extracted and would be sold in Europe. Health screening and quarantine process for diseases was integrated within the depot. The next step was the new workplace, the plantation and the new living space, housing. It's not very clear, the text, but we are working on a book and the museum gallery as well, where we are documenting all the depots where the laborers arrived and what was their first experience of arrival. We document similarly the sugar plantation, and the estate house had a big role to play in this sugar plantation because it was used as a place of surveillance. And it's a surveillance that's not very different from the surveillance world that we currently live in. Whichever country you talk about, we live in a highly surveyed world, from our phones to our social media to the online world. But this was physical surveillance. So the estate house had to be placed in a very strategic location. These are looking at the estate houses and the plantations in 8 different countries. We studied a plantation in each of the colonies, and then we went into the depth of how the estate house worked. And on a parallel thread, this was the house of the colonist who ran the plantation. On a parallel thread, there were the barracks where the actual laborers would live, and they would create places of worship to familiarize themselves with, to bring back something that is familiar from home. These are some of this is in Reunion Island next to Mauritius. This is in Jamaica. Similar architecture. It's very strange that the connection between the Western world and the colonial centers of Bombay and Calcutta is very, it's deep down, because a lot of the people, civil engineers primarily or surveyors doing these houses, were British, or designing the factories were the same guys who were doing the warehouses in Mumbai, in Bombay and Calcutta. So there's the world of Eastern United States and the world of Eastern India was very much connected through colonialism. These were the sugar mills and factories we studied, and our idea was people, often the normative spaces of living and working is not highlighted. I don't think that is the case in this school at all. But we, in our own way, I think I like the exercise, the student projects that you guys do in and around Mumbai. But in our own way, for the gallery and for the research that we are doing, we tried to look into, and this, I teach a graduate studio I mean, the studio doesn't have any particular focus, but we tried to do research on typologies. Typology is a very core focus of the work that we do. So we tried to look into these sugar mills and sugar factories around the world, focusing, there were 16 countries where these laborers moved to, but we primarily focused on 8 of them, which had a dominant population of Indian laborers migrating. These are some archival photos of the factories and a general sense of how program was distributed. And then the next thing was housing. Where do you live? Where do the laborers live? The first option was they would build housing barracks. The image on the very right are housing barracks in Mauritius for labor housing. And then eventually some laborers decided to build their own home. And it's a weird mix of relying on memory, their notion of home from the villages of northern India, to the materials available at hand in these plantation colonies, which was not a lot. But the image on the left is South Africa. You see, you have a thatched roof, angan, a veranda. The one image in the middle is a raised house in the middle of a plantation in Guyana. Guyana is a place that is highly marshy and would get flooded. So they came up with these new typologies where a family or 2 families would live. We looked at these typologies from a single family house to a plantation labor house to a barrack for a few families to a much larger labor camp that happened primarily in South Africa, also because they had South Africa as a landmass had more space than any of these island countries that the laborers moved to. So the 2 images on the left were about labor camps in South Africa. Then you could see these 3 images, these particular ones, they had an influence. They tried to recreate from similar materials in a very, very distant land. So the role of memory when you don't have a photograph, when you don't have a phone, you're just traveling with a few clothes, and sometimes even without anything. How do you recreate something from back in your village in this colony? Is a very interesting mental journey that they went through after 4 months of being at sea. I'll move to the last part where I think this is very important. In the transatlantic slavery, of course, it's probably the most dehumanizing human project of all time, but this came very close. I say the transatlantic slavery was more dehumanizing than the indenture trade, is because for transatlantic slavery, there was a complete loss of memory of their language, of their songs, of their methods of worshipping, of their methods of the sacred. But in the indenture trade, they were allowed, because they were quote unquote paid workers, they were allowed to build their own houses and speak their own languages. Some of these countries still speak a version of Creole, which is a mix of multiple languages, but it still carries roots of these North Indian languages or South Indian languages in Mauritius. Sacred spaces of indenture were environments of refuge. The newly arrived carried with them memories of the sacred from their villages. Only a few would carry physical objects, small religious idols and images. And this was before photography was accessible by the masses. The sacred was recreated from memory. The transformations are a reflection of the nature of memory. Sheds were appropriated, parts of an old barrack became a religious space, and eventually there were ground up temples, mosques, and churches. And even after indenture labor trade was not happening anymore, it was illegalized, people still moved, and people who moved in the 1900s were moving with photographs of their villages, and that was easy to recreate. Later migrations not related to indenture would help in a more accurate translation, but meaning often is unrelated to accuracy. This it's a lot of buildings in there, and it's not super clear, but I didn't want it to be legible, but we looked at a temple, a mosque, and a church in each of the colonies, and a church that was not by the colonists, but was started by the laborers. Mostly it was temples, a small part, there were mosques that were built. For every 8 temples, there were 2 mosques that were built, which kind of explains the religious disposition of India back then or currently. And I'm just throwing in only 3 examples of what we looked at. The mosque, of course, its alignment with the cardinal, with Mecca. And this is in a busy street in Mauritius, and how the frontage changed. And there are many other examples where a old colonial building, the laborers, once they made enough money, would buy and convert it into a temple. This is a more a church that maintains a farm, so this was built much later on. Migration and labor, slavery and indenture labor. Is architecture a facilitator of this dehumanizing project of human history, a passive bystander that absorbed history and culture, creating new typologies, creating new conditions of living? Can we create spaces that capture time and empower us with potent experiences of historical conditions? Not merely as an ethical or a memorialization project, but a project conveying the relationship of our bodies within space and time against forces of labor and human migration. We come on to our projects. This is the site. It's not exactly the site of, it's right next to an indenture memorial, a nondescript. A small memorial was built in 2011 by a person who is currently the president of the India Diaspora Council in New York, which connects all these indenture countries. And I'm working with the India Diaspora Council along with the Port Trust to initiate a separate project, which would be called the India Diaspora Center. That will also be along the river. But this entire waterfront along the Calcutta side, for those of you familiar with Kolkata, that's the river Hooghly, and the other side is Howrah, this side is Kolkata. This used to be a dry dock where there were a lot of old industrial buildings. And the museum would sort of sit on top of this building, use the building and also sit on top of the dock. Our idea initially was to save the industrial building. We tried our very best, but we were not allowed to keep it. It was demolished in the end. But what we did was rebuild the structure as is, the exact same footprint of the original structure, but recladded with specific meanings to indenture labor. So that's our site. There were 3 pitched volumes. The one on the very right, it got demolished 20 years back. These 2 were remaining volumes. They were not in the best of state, but nonetheless, they could have been preserved. But that's a story for another presentation. But we decided to build the 3 volumes the exact same way. Regarding the interior of the ships, the way people were transported as almost like human cargo from one place across the oceans to another country. That's an image on the top of the ship, and the image on the left is in the hull of the ship. And this particular one is a decommissioned slave ship. The only thing that was missing in these were the shackles, right? You don't have handcuffs, you don't have shackles. These laborers were free, but the space, the compression of space that happened inside this ship is something we tried to portray in the architecture on the exterior of the building by taking these units of sleeping that was 5'3" by the height was 2 feet and the depth was 16 inches. That's the exact same volumes that we replicated with those modules on the main volume. And for the smaller volumes that became the entrance lobby, and you go up into the galleries, on the right, you have the museum store. We used the same proportion, but reduced it in scale to create sort of a filigree work, but primarily focused on the main volume. weathered steel is often used as a stylistic statement, but we felt that we couldn't use any other material in this site because of the way the site was. And if we were to keep those old buildings with the old rusted structures, this made total sense. This is a prototype that we were playing with, where we were taking solid steel and rusting it using hydrogen peroxide and other chemicals for fast rusting. But we were also wary of the fact that, how much rusting do you want, because you're right by the sea. So you have to use a certain thickness of the metal. This is coming out to be a little different, but so that's our site. Those are the 3 volumes. That's the River Hooghly. That's the backwater for where the ships come in. These are the 2 dry docks. And that's our museum right there. So that's the inside of the museum. The museum sort of hangs, sits on top of the dry dock that becomes an amphitheater. And we expose all the trusses inside, and we have a structure that goes up only to the level of the columns, and where the exhibits are displayed, and the top is completely exposed. That's a building from the side. Where the indexing of a sleeping module on the facade of the building is made evidently clear, and the same depth has been used to create a shadow that gives a sense of space rather than just a facade treatment. Towards the Hooghly, the riverside, I mean, it's a solid facade because we wanted light to be very strategic, and this is the side where the building faces the river, so you can look out into the river. That's where the light is coming from, the only source of light. Last year we had a 4-month exhibit of our projects at AIA New York, and we exhibited our model with that's sugar from the same plantation in Guyana that still sells sugar, but obviously without indenture labor, because New York has a high Guyanese Jamaican population. We were able to source the actual sugar, and we have a sample of the rusted metal. That's the site currently. A couple of months back. Staying on the topic of migration, I'm just quickly going to move to partition. I have a personal connect with partition. My grandparents migrated from what is now Bangladesh, but not before, but not after, but before partition. My grandfather was working in what would become West Bengal or India later on. So these are images of. This is an image of a large Hindu mansion that was left in Dhaka when the family migrated to Calcutta. These are some settlements that were set up outside of Kolkata, and these 2 images are settlements that were set up on the roadside to house the many refugees that came to India. As I said before, we worked with 1947 Partition Archive, which has the largest oral history collection of more than 10,000 interviews of people who survived the genocide or people who migrated and have since migrated to the West or are in India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. And through the projects, I've made friends with a lot of writers from Pakistan and Bangladesh, movie makers and writers. I have a presentation that's happening in Lahore, but with my travels between India and US, I was not able to secure a visa, but I would love to go there someday. So we would talk about some of the exhibition projects and then move to the virtual project, which is potentially going to become a physical museum. Partition is a testimony to the irrationalities of empire and all imperial regimes, which often ruptures community evolution distorts historical trajectories and forces violent state formations from societies that otherwise would have taken different and unknowable paths. Partition is a permanent message of the jeopardies of imperial rule and the responses to extreme nationalism. That's an image, that's a map of India in 1929 at the peak of colonial British rule, but the red are the provinces that were directly under British control. So many of you would know this, but a big majority of India was not directly under. They were the princely states. There were some 523 princely states when India became free that got integrated into the country, including Hyderabad, where there was a military intervention. On the right, you have figure ground of Delhi before and after partition. Delhi, primarily the modern Delhi, is a collection of a lot of refugee neighborhoods, which have since become super affluent neighborhoods. But they started out as land that was granted for free to refugees coming in from modern-day Pakistan or even Bangladesh, East Pakistan. There are a series of exhibits that we did on the oral history projects. This was called Women During Partition. So a lot of the partition narrative and a lot of partition literature has been heavily focused on upper middle class people and often heavily men-centric. So this exhibition tried to show the additional burden of partition and what they went through during partition from all parts of South Asia. This was called Refugees of the British Empire. This is in Berkeley, California. And the last project where we archived, there's an amazing team of historians who worked to archive 25 interviews of, I would say these are more subaltern interviews of people who are still, there's this part of India called Dondokaranno, where when refugees migrated from Bangladesh to Bengal, there wasn't enough space, and then the West Bengal government decided to move them to parts of Orissa and current-day Andhra Pradesh. And so some of these refugee interviews have been taken from by going to the fields in Andhra Pradesh and Orissa, where they still go through the same ordeal that they have been going. So 1971 was when Bangladesh was formed, and there was a new set of refugees that came to India, and they were pushed to this part of India that I'm talking about, mostly forests. So what we did for the virtual space is that you can read all the interviews. It's a work in progress website currently, but it also looked into the material histories of Bengal from different time periods and archived them in a space. This would be a virtual space where you could move through and read or listen to the refugees that are mapped on the wall. And we are talking to a potential group to create a physical museum, but of course it won't be of this scale. It will be a very small museum, but the idea is to exhibit these subaltern narratives of partition that was not spoken about, and also talk about the material histories of Bengal and the continuities between Bangladesh and West Bengal. We have done several sets of projects with the World Bank. That's how we started working initially. We did a project. We did a project in Sarnath where we looked at the urban revitalization and creating a marketplace, and it was an urban design project, and majority of it wasn't taken forward or built. This was a project in Agra, which was a kilometer away from Taj Mahal, to build a place for, it was called the Center for Living Traditions, to support and help artisans who are struggling and who are working in traditional craft forms like marble inlay work, embroidery. This also has been on hold, but I wanted to see. And then the third project that I'm going to show also was in Lumbini, that got built, it was an adaptive reuse of an old Kenzo structure. So this is a project in red. That's that's a Taj Mahal complex. It was, you have a radius within which major construction cannot happen. So we were looking into a lot of the codes and how to get this work done. We started by doing a lot of workshops with the artisans. These are women and men, a majority of them Muslim men and women, who are amazing craftspeople that are living in the nooks and crannies of Agra, in these small urban villages. And the initial idea was to document the work they are doing. And there are groups that the World Bank works with that would facilitate moving some of these groups and organization into the place that we were going to build. So this is marble inlay work. That's a photograph we took of two, beautiful pieces that they created. And we were told not to use any Islamic elements by the government we were working with. And after several rounds of doing something modernist that we hated, we were able to convince them to use a subtle form of architecture that sort of responds to the amazing architecture of Agra and Fatehpur Sikri. I personally like Fatehpur Sikri more than Taj Mahal just because of the scale, and Taj Mahal, of course, you cannot compete with that. And our goal was to create a place that is more humble and responds to the scale of Fatehpur Sikri, also in terms of materiality, work with red sandstone. And Taj Mahal was there, something that is there. You could see Taj Mahal from our site if you were at a slightly higher level. There was an existing 3-story building. We could see the Taj Mahal. But we did decide to work with the geometries of Mughal architecture using the 4-point, the Mughal arch, and splitting the arch and using a half arch. I'm not going into the details of how we worked on the geometries, but the whole marketplace that we designed was revolving around creating a simpler version of Mughal architecture that could be used as a marketplace. And the village that we created for the artisans to work, that would be a much more humble brick village where there would be 4 clusters for each of the 4 craft forms that we were working with. So that's a prototype of the market building, where the tourists would come into the interior environment. They would buy the objects, and then they would get on a e-rickshaw to go to Taj Mahal, which is a kilometer away. This was initially supposed to be in red sandstone. There was also a mandate to generate 10,000 hours of labor for stone artisans, because that's what the project was about. So we created this relief work that was, without reinventing the wheel, using and working with some of the motifs that are already there in Fatehpur Sikri. So that's the campus. And we have these recessed columns. When you light that up, you get these shadow arches that also form the same profile. So, which we thought was interesting. It was not intentional, but it happened in the method of iterating through the design and testing with lighting. And that's the village towards the back of the campus where the artisans would work. We were involved in the Buddhist Circuit project, which traced the life of the Buddha. The goal of the project was to highlight Buddhism in the land where it initially started. That was the goal of the World Bank. So the projects that were being discussed were in Lumbini, Kushinagar, Sarnath. We worked in Sarnath and Lumbini. Unfortunately, the project has not been maintained well. A lot of disrepair, and oftentimes that is the case. This is the master plan that was created by Kenzo Tange in the 1970s. So that's to the very right, you see Raja Mahendra, and that's Yuthant. He used to be the UN Secretary General um, from Burma, and he visited and allocated a fund, and Kenzo Tange was involved. He created the master plan. But with all master plans, a lot of villages were displaced. And you work with this perfect geometry of creating this rectangle and the circle, pushing out all the villages, just preserving the temple where Buddha, which was the place where Buddha was born. So we inherited these structures, these pavilions in the master plan that was built, which we cleaned up and worked with the geometries that were already there, these barrel vaulted brick arches with semicircular geometries, and tried to augment those geometries with woodwork, with polished cement, with local lights. These are some of the initial renditions of the space. On the top floor, double height, and this is the entrance to the cafe. These are some images of construction, the final building, the final project. I'll quickly share a couple of our institutional projects that serve as our efforts in preserving memories and motives of the city into new projects. So we are doing Manchester City's first international school in India. This is in Calcutta. Calcutta has a long history of football. Football started in the 1800s. The first football club in Asia was set up in Calcutta. So the city has a long history. The football clubs, East Bengal, Mohun Bagan, in the Football League was set up there. So the project was set up in a way that how could we add to that history of the city and reference the history of the stadiums? We inherited an empty site with an existing building that it's quite a large project of about 2.5 lakh square feet. So the existing building remains. We work with it, do some surgical work on the building and add a taller building that's 12-story tall. So the goal of the project was to create a stadium that could be used as a school, or parts of the building could be a stadium. In these two drawings, you can see that's the football field, and a stadium seating that acts as an extension of some of their social spaces inside. And these are open classrooms that have terraces. You don't get the perfect view when you sit on these steps, but you have to stand to watch the game. But how do we create a 40-meter, high-rise that addresses a football field, and you address the history of Manchester City Club, but also the history of football. So this is under construction right now. That's what we came up with a striated facade that takes the steps and creates these open classrooms and has a stadium seating that opens up into the football. And the existing building is to your left, and that's the building we are adding as a L that has all the functions. That's the boundary wall is being constructed right now. It's done. Calcutta, this part of the city to the right of the Eastern Bypass, it's highly marshy. This has been settled in later times, but the site had major water issues that had to be dealt with, super deep pile foundations. These are some images of the interior spaces where we are creating a swimming pool for the sports academy at the very top of the building. Then these are the classrooms that open up to the right onto the stadium. And then the open space of the site has been taken over completely by the football field. So there are no social spaces for the students. There's a very tiny garden that will act as a play space. But what we tried to do is create a 4-story atrium that would act as a social space, or the hub of the institute, where the two L's, where the primary and the secondary school meet at the cusp of this four-story atrium that also becomes like a performance space, becomes a social space. We are working on another project that also deals with, works with the history of the city of Kolkata. This is being developed right now, where we look at, this is a school of business, so we looked into the history of commerce in Calcutta before, I mean, a majority of it, primarily it is the colonial time, and looking at what the elements of the city feels like with the louvered windows. There's a slight sense of domesticity to the right, but then there's an institutionalization in the right, where you see larger panes of larger mansions rather than the smaller domestic spaces to the left. And we are working, this is an existing building that we are working with, where we are redoing the exterior, carving out some interior spaces, and working with a louvered terracotta facade, but we are implementing it with GFRC. And some of the interior spaces are, the library, we are working with existing geometries of the building, and the business school classrooms. I'm coming to the end of the presentation. I'll just, I'll have a couple of projects I'll try to go through quickly. How am I doing with time? Probably over. So we are doing a couple of adaptive reuse projects, in one in Rajasthan and one in Shantiniketan. I'm not showing the one in Shantiniketan, showing the one in Rajasthan in Shekhawati. Adaptive reuse feels like something that is definitely environmentally sustainable. We have a big building stock. How can we work with existing buildings rather than building new ones? But we also looked at the migration of the Marwari community from Shekhawati to Calcutta. When Calcutta became the capital of the British Empire, there was commerce, there was a lot of wealth to be made, and how this community from Western India, where they were living in places that were very dry, had drought very often. They would come to Calcutta, make their money, become prominent businessmen in Calcutta and also in Mumbai. For this project, we are focused in Calcutta because the client, Ambuja Neotia, is a family that migrated 200 years back to Calcutta. So we looked at the migration routes they took within Rajasthan, how people moved and why they moved. And that's Shekhawati, that's Ramgarh Shekhawati, where we are restoring an existing Haveli and building a new hotel ground up. The existing Haveli, it's Shekhawati, for all of you, who have been there, it's an amazing place with a lot of frescoes on the facades of Havelis. But most of these Havelis, they were not allowed to go above a certain height. They were not allowed to compete with royalty. So the scale of many of the Havelis are highly domestic. They were meant for domestic purposes, but when you convert it into a hotel with a Taj group, they have, modern amenities of hospitality do not apply to some of the spaces that they live in. So that's the Haveli that we inherited. A lot of black crusting. There are better Havelis in terms of the fresco work. This is certainly not one of the best ones. But interestingly enough, in Rajasthan, the fresco work that was happening had a lot of theme that was related to colonial Calcutta. So there was Victoria, Queen Victoria, there was Gandhiji, there was rivers, because you don't have coconut trees in Rajasthan, but there were a lot of motifs of Bengal that are replicated in these Havelis, because the people who were working and building these Havelis, they were in Calcutta. That's primarily their life in Calcutta. So they were trying to sort of build some memories of their now home in Shekhawati. So there are a lot of it's a it's a 4-suite Haveli, so large suites, about 800 square feet. The spaces are highly domestic. I'm not going into the details of it. We tried to map some of these frescoes that you see on the inside and which ones to preserve and which ones not to preserve. That's a big question, especially when you are working in a Haveli. There are thousands of Havelis in the Shekhawati area, maybe not 1,000, but, and many of them, the quality of the work is not as good, the painting. And what do? Do you recreate? The general impulse for the client is to recreate everything and make it look good. But we have tried to do, have a David Chipperfield kind of approach where we are adding anything that we are adding in a different material. We are restoring the old with lime plaster and preserving some of the old paintings while recreating some of the new and some of them into new motifs. So this is a visualization of the Haveli. We are adding a lap pool in the middle of the Haveli, in the center of the courtyard. So the pavilions are mainly for dining, and these are the suites that open up through a narrow corridor into the terrace. All of the new work is happening with, we are using limestone to do the new work, and all the repair work is happening with different pigments of lime plaster. And chemically, when you mix lime plaster, when you mix lime with water and you make lime plaster, when it dries up, it becomes calcium carbonate, gets same properties of limestone. So there's a very interesting material dialogue between limestone and lime plaster that we thought was very critical and interesting in the project. So these are more images of the Haveli, where you see this extension of a new room that is being done in limestone. All of the old parts of the Haveli stay in the way they are, with repair work in lime plaster. That's the inside. We are. I have never used green before in any of my projects, and it was. We didn't know how it would be, because there was the Haveli, current Haveli has a lot of very interesting colors, and we worked with this separation where the lower part was beige and the top is green for the lower floor. And as you go up on the residential where the suites are, the lower part is green and the bottom is, and the top is beige. And this is all lime plaster repair work that we are doing. Making MEP work in the Haveli is a nightmare when you want to hide everything, right? You want to hide all the conduit work, all the ducts, if you are lucky to use ducts. So I think that has been a really good challenge. We are breaking ground very soon, in a couple of months, post-monsoon, hopefully. And in the same city, these are existing Havelis that are there, that has a endless repetition of these brackets. And for our new hotel that we are working on, we wanted the entire structure to be out of limestone, but have a reverence to this rhythm of brackets. We created a facade with different treatments of limestone, smooth, buffed. That's the entrance to the Haveli. That's the back where you have a small rock garden. We initially, I was mentioning before to Rupali, Apurva, we did work with some smaller NGOs in the Sundarbans. This was right after Amphan had hit, and it's a very different thread of work. Right after Amphan had hit, a lot of villages were displaced, and particularly we looked at the villages that were mostly hit.
Of course, we don't have any ground presence. We try to identify with the NGO which are the communities that got mostly affected.
To move to Sundarbans by the British 200 years back as as a community that would cut down the forest. So when we look back at the roots of a lot of modern day problems of flooding, of climate change that's happening, a lot of the answers or the starting points lie in this notion of infinite resource extraction that happened during colonial time period. Sundarban is a beautiful landscape. There are some similarities with Kerala, with a lot of coconut trees, rice paddy fields, but there's also a dark side to the story. There's poverty. A lot of people have left to work in places, other cities like Calcutta, immediately next to it, but also places like Delhi and Mumbai and Bangalore. So with COVID, when the reverse migration was happening, a lot of people went back to these villages, and it was, all of you are familiar with what happened with the reverse migration. And right when the reverse migration was happening, Amphan hit. That was May 2020, a couple of months into COVID. And we tried to be there on ground, and we, with the NGO, we identified the Munda tribal community that has been living in this village that keeps losing land every year with land loss that happens at the river. And we started working with them to work on two things. Initially, we worked on a prototype, of a house, a larger house that would also act as storm shelter, but then also create, with a hybrid material system, bamboo and concrete, a school and a health center that would function as a storm shelter. So we got a grant from Start Network in UK to build this. It's almost completed, not fully constructed, but it was a hybrid system where the base was in concrete and bamboo. And then you slowly transition to a bamboo system where you have a caster slab, and then it's a completely bamboo structure. I'll end with this project. This is close to Mumbai. I have been coming to Mumbai for the last couple of years when I am in Delhi. We are working with a California NGO called High Five Foundation. And we are working in a place where the site has a lot of basalt rocks. So we visited the site, also visited some of the stone quarries that were there. And the NGO works with underprivileged kids around India in 7 provinces, and they have been teaching them sports and using sports as a device to uplift them. Some of them will become professional sportsmen. Some of them will probably move on to some other field, but they are they have been working with different communities, tribal communities across India. So we have visited Bhopal, around Calcutta, the region that the NGO works in. So what we felt was important for the project was, of course, the story of the place where we are building, which is a highly rocky landscape that also has a lot of greenery. So there are these rock outcroppings, and when we looked at our site, we didn't know which part of the site was covered in rock, which part wasn't, because there was always a soil layer on top. And then there's the story of these kids that we spend time. They run programs in a lot of BMC schools. We went there. They run programs in Bhopal, in schools in Calcutta. And those are other NGOs that work with within districts where there are a lot of slums. So the way we organized the campus was these very simple buildings, but that came out of the place. We worked with basalt, but different expressions of basalt, from random rubble masonry to stonecrete to gabion wall, and create a campus that there'll be a lot of outdoor basketball courts. Basketball is the central thing that they are taught to play. So the basketball courts need a certain alignment with the sun angle. That gave us the alignment of the campus with the north. And that helped in arranging. These two buildings that you see are the arenas, where the indoor arenas are there. You have your outdoor courts. You have the central part of the campus with the amphitheater and the dining hall. And then you have your residential quarters where the kids live. These were multiple courtyard buildings. So that's the entrance building. This is something, this is potentially going to finish construction by end of the year, where it is a steel and a random rubble masonry structure in basalt, where the offices of the foundation would be on one side and the other side would be a triple height space that would serve as the as a place for playing basketball. We created between the two arenas, there was a space where teams, when they visit from outside, would be able to gather. That's an indoor arena that we are working with. That's the residential building where we were working with coursed masonry of basalt, but since the beginning, since the concept stage, it has changed into a stonecrete. But so the idea was to have material differences between public and private programs. These are the courtyards that are there inside the hostel. That's their prayer hall that has a gabion wall. That's our site. And I mean, the amount of stone that came out, it's you talk about building a project from the site. This almost came true, but we realized that a lot of the stone cannot be load bearing. So some of the load bearing structures, we had to get stone from other stone quarries after material tests. That was from the beginning of the year. I don't have a drone footage from the recent time, but I would like to end there saying that we are interested in the physical and the metaphysical condition created through parallel dialogues between space and time, material and labor, and culture and nature. Within this multiplicity of dialogues, meaning is created through connections, connecting the story of the material with the story of the place and people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to everyone for being here, and thank you so much, Aurgho. So just because we're a little bit short on time, I'll just say that, we'll have a conversation right now at the table itself, and then we can open up the conversation to the audience. And also since we are streaming live on YouTube, in case there are any questions or comments from the YouTube channel, then we'll be taking those as well. So that'll just be the session for today. And, I just wanted to say, thank you so much for taking us in such careful ways through your work and through your practice. And I think it's on. Okay. And, for really sort of, making this argument against, architecture as invention, but really about architecture as this act of careful listening, really. So, to listening to histories and to materials and to the exigencies of the site, etc. And then, you see built form as being less about something that is producing novelty, and more about entering into an already unfolding conversation, and a conversation that has maybe been going on for centuries. Maybe it's a very, current conversation. And, so in a sense, the architect is coming in and producing these relationships, or entering into dialogue with these relationships that even predate their presence on the site itself. And, you see that in your work really, and you see it as, history as a projective practice. And that's one of the main ideas that has been running through most of the work, which is, that history is not something that architecture is merely preserving, but it works as an instrument, like you instrumentalize history in order to produce built form. And I just wanted to speak to you about that process a little bit, because, your practice is something that takes the site or the context and it reads it. It may not always be that way, but it reads it as a very, very thick context. And there's a critical inquiry into the context as well. And then it enters into these methods of historical research that, that preface the act of the spatial intervention. So I wanted to ask you a little bit firstly about, as an architect, what are the ways, or what kind of research or historical research that goes into this sort of inquiry into the site? And the other thing is, how does the archive then become like an instrument for design thinking or spatial thinking? Because on the one hand, you have, the classical architectural form of the archive, which is looking at documenting the types, etc. And then you're also engaging with these other forms, which are oral histories, or they're these very powerful images very often. And these are forms of materials or of historical records that themselves are have these very strong affective dimensions. So how do those then become translated, or what are the processes through which these bleed into or inform the act of space making? So that's, that would be the question.
Am I audible? Yeah. Apurva. It's on? It's on? Can you hear me? Thank you, Apurva, for the question. And thank you for, I think the best thing about presenting the work and creating with fellow researchers, academicians like all of you, and also the students, is to have you frame it from your point of view, and you probably put it in a way that I can also learn from, about the work we are doing ourselves. But I feel we are really against creating newness, and that is, I feel, is not because we want to be different, because I feel there's a problem in creating newness. I feel when you create something new, you cut it off. So the entire technology world is about creating disruptions, right? You say a startup is great when you disrupt something, and we say the opposite thing. Architecture is great when it provides continuity and not disrupt. So I feel when you are not disrupting, when you provide continuity, you are not creating newness. I don't think our job is to create new knowledge and new things every moment of the day. I think our job is to connect with our past and the future. So I think that sort of frames the practice, is that we don't like newness. If there is any newness, I think it is almost taking the past and reframing it in a different garment. But the materials are not anything new. It comes from the site or comes from the context. And about our experience of working with oral histories, I feel I'm not an expert in oral history. I've worked with historians who are experts. Or for this museum, the archival work that we have been going through is really, really interesting, and almost makes you feel disinterested in new architecture, right? I feel the story of the people is way more interesting than anything I presented, honestly. Like, I think our stories are way more powerful than creating anything new. So I think we try to drive and get energy from those stories of people, of the places. And we are only starting out. We had just been around for 4 years, but I feel we identifying those places and projects that can help us in doing that is very important. But I do feel that our oral histories are way more powerful than any story that you can talk about creating a novel architecture, right? I think those stories are very important. And I don't know, I hope that answers you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I didn't mean new in the sense of like, inventing something, but it's more like, the bringing up of a narrative that has been lost is something that would disrupt dominant narratives. So in that sense, it is about producing disruption to, like hegemonic ideas of history, or like a hegemonic retelling of history, or as you yourself put it, like, the colonial imperialistic urges that shape how we see the world, etc. So
I think, a lot of history that we see is through the leftover of built heritage of history, which is mostly royal architecture. You don't have any leftover remnants of how common people lived. The houses are there no more. You have the palaces and the forts left. So I would say that looking at it from a different lens disrupts that mainstream way of looking at history, is to look at it from a certain subaltern way. Like especially what we were trying to do with the research on indenture is look at precisely what you're saying, not look at the normative ways of looking at history.
Yeah. Yes, and also because, like the research is about also, it looks, the research on indentured labor, and it's also part of a lot of your other work as well. It looks at that architectural type, and it looks at the evolution of that type. And then perhaps there are ways in which, the architectural project does not directly, because the project that you showed in the Calcutta wetlands, which is now going to become the museum, that is, I'm just wondering if from this documentation of the type, is there any kind of, is that form of documentation allowing you to speculate on new ways of thinking through the type of the typology of the museum that you are working with, or even in the Heritage Hotel, it comes from a certain, it's built around a certain idea of inhabitation and living and behaviors. And then would your project also, of course, the program is different. It is about living and inhabitation, but of a different sort. But is your method of working, which is looking at histories and ways in which people have inhabited spaces before, does it let you speculate on these new forms and new inhabitations?
I think that's a very good question, and it's a very difficult thing to do too, I feel. But we are trying. I feel for, let's say for the Haveli and the hotel project, it's so much easier to do the Haveli, although it's very hard to do the conservation work, but the plan has been done for you, just placing things and repairing things. But for the Heritage Hotel, it is slightly more difficult because you have a brief where you have to provide a certain number of rooms and certain number of amenities, which oftentimes gets limited to material treatment of places and how things are perceived. But the actual planning of the space often becomes more mainstream, like how a contemporary hotel would work. You want to give that experience. But for the museum, how does a museum type get influenced by a factory? Mm-hmm. The building that we are replicating was a dock, dry dock. So it was an industrial building, and that's being repurposed as a museum, but it's been demolished, and we are rebuilding it as a museum. So I think there is a direct influence of the way a factory worked, or the way an industrial building works. And certainly it influences the type of a museum, not with the way the sequence of spaces work, because you have to follow a certain sequence of spaces in a museum, certain number of galleries, transition between galleries, they have to be followed. But generally, the space making and how materials interact in that space, I think there is a deep influence of studying typology, different typologies that can have influence on the museum typology.
Yeah, because, also speaking of Amitav Ghosh, and this is something I know that Rupali is also brought up in classes very often, is in the first book of the Ibis trilogy, which is The Sea of Poppies, when they talk about, entering the whole factory area where they're crushing the seeds and they're extracting opium from there. There is this, you're led, the writing is something that is able to lead you through those spaces. And then you think of the bodies. I mean, you're not there present yourself, but you are made to think of the bodies and think of the labor and think of the space itself. And I'm wondering if, in the Calcutta, in the wetlands project as well, if the existing circulation of the factory itself is something that, then you want to reference, or does that are the previous forms of inhabitations, then do they get referenced back into these kinds of works?
No, I think that's a brilliant question. But I feel in literature and movie making, you are able to curate a viewer, right? Because when you are in a space, no one's stopping you from looking around. But when you are in a movie, you're seeing a space through a certain frame. Same with literature, like you are almost framing things for the viewer to look. Architecture, it becomes harder in a way because you are free to do whatever. But in a space like a museum where it's a space-time, where space and time converge, it is certainly possible to do that by the functions of the previous building. We did not do it. It was more set up as what you're seeing sequentially, historically. From that was a brief that was given. You move between histories, and certainly in a space. But I think that's a very difficult thing to do. Again, I think, but I like what you bring about. I think it's a very interesting thing.
Thank you. And I noticed that there were. We talk a lot about the process that goes into design making, and what are the ways in which you think through acts of space making, perhaps in the drawing. And I know that you've been using collages. You presented some of them. There was one of the windows of the front in the facade in Calcutta. There was some of the basalt stones as well. I was wondering if you could speak to what this form of drawing or what this form of making allows you to do. Like what is the sensory distillation? Because for me, they were very sensorially charged, both those forms of collages. So how does that form of drawing or of making just allow you to distill something that informs space making?
So I have a background in visual arts. Like I went to art school when I was a 3-year-old kid. So the presentation doesn't have a lot of sketches, but we do a lot of sketches for the projects. It is unfortunately mostly it's digital, but we do these collages. But there's also a little bit of writing that happens when the project starts, even before sketching, because sketching is your first way of externalizing what's going on. Mm-hmm. But even before sketching, I think putting down thoughts and writing a couple of paragraphs, what the project context is, what the project wants to be, and then move on to sketching. But I think the way in which you produce a drawing really, because this is the only art form I feel that is detached from the process of making. In terms of, we don't build our architecture, right?
Yep.
We draw our architecture,
yes.
But we are not, when I go visit a construction site, when I'm traveling between Delhi, Calcutta and Mumbai, between our sites, I feel very awkward going to a construction site. I feel they are doing it and they know more. And when you criticize something, I'm very conscious of that. Like many architects go to a construction site to criticize things, but I do feel that they are actually picking and putting things together that I'm not doing. My partner or the team is not doing. We are sitting in an office, going to the site occasionally. So drawing is and model making are the two methods of making that closely resembles the actual process of building architecture, because we are not, unless we're doing a very small project, we're not involved in building things. And even if you have a design build practice, you are not really in the field doing things, right? So I feel the role of drawing then becomes really important, and also the role of writing becomes important, and the role of model making. These three sort of form a trifecta for me. And to me, drawing is sort of core, because you're working a lot of these thoughts out and working with the team, getting opinions about what they feel the project should be about. But I'm just maybe extending your question, but like model making, when you grow fast as a practice, we would like to do more models, but it becomes harder to manage the pace of a project by building models. It takes time, right? So oftentimes our models are post-produced as a after fact of after the design is done. And we explore in the digital space, but writing and sketching, I think, is core, and doing these collages help us in getting these snippets of history in one page, where we are looking at multiple images, how they come together, and then we don't come up with any literal translation, but I think it does help us in seeing all the fragments of the city that for our institutional projects that we want to see together to influence that project, almost shut out the rest of the world, right? Like you're just seeing that, cutting those pieces out, and you're just looking at those stairs, or you're just looking at those window louvers, and not one of them, 20 of them together, and then see, okay, these are from the old city.
No, because when you see that facade, and then you see those windows that then get collaged repeatedly one over the other, and then then the next image is that of the terracotta louvers, and then it just sort of seems to come together in terms of the translations from drawing to buildings. I was wondering what that method was. And, especially because you said, and this is something that, we say all the time, that, you're making the main work of the architect is to draw the building, think about the building, script the building, write the building, engage in dialogue in space making itself. And I feel like that's a form of practice that you have made, where it's about assembling knowledges. And you're working with craftspeople, and you're working with historians and engineers, and you're looking at all of these workshops, and you really see the architect as the stakeholder in the project. And there's like a collective intelligence at work in the putting together of all of these buildings. So what do you feel is the role of the, not the role of the architect, because that's a very tired question, but what do you feel are like the implications of this distributed expertise on building making?
I think, we are not experts in anything, right? We are trained to be generalists. So being a generalist and practicing, being a generalist of optimism, almost like architecture, it is a practice of optimism, but being a generalist, so you're touching upon 10 things, none of them you are an expert in. So it sort of blends in, and in a traditional building sense, those experts are MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and structural engineers. But how do you broaden that horizon to involve historians, or to understand craft practices by research, or by also engaging with people? I think they have a similar role to play, that we rely on their knowledge to create something. Like we rely on a mechanical engineer's knowledge to do how to cool a space or passively heat a building, because we are not experts. We know a little bit about everything. So I feel it's a gradual extension of that, almost. Like working with historians is almost working with a structural engineer, because they are providing a different kind of structure to thought, rather than structure to the building. And that is super important to conceptualize a building, I think.
And, given that the material choices for all of these projects, of course, they're coming from like this environment, they're coming from the region and they're coming from the exigencies of the environment. But very often there's there's an aspirational dimension to how these materials are used as well. So you have, how can I say it? Like, it's not just about using the material, but it's about lending the new grammar to the material almost. So because it's about, so much of your work is about meaning making and extending a history, I'm just wondering if you could speak to how this new imagination and new ways of working with these materials like shift the meanings of what these materials come with.
Yeah, so I think, we are looking at several projects in the hills that's looking at stone and wooden architecture for hotel project, but we are looking at traditional architecture projects, vernacular practices that put two materials together a certain way, right? But often in a lot of contemporary contexts, you're not able to do the exact same thing, and that there has to be a gradual evolution of how materials are put together from the exact same way the vernacular buildings work. So there is it's a messy process, I would say. It's not perfect. We are learning a lot by working with these people, and also realizing certain things that you draw are not easily achievable. How do you change it? How do you modify it to do it a certain way? And then also working with steel and random rubble masonry, that's not a common thing to do. It has its own challenges. So you're creating a new way of doing it because you need a super long span structure that is not done traditionally using these materials. So it's almost a material that should not be used for a long span structure because it's for load bearing shorter smaller structures. How do you do that? By integrating steel into it? Or in case of Rajasthan, like, I think there the translation has been more direct because it's easy. You're seeing, you're learning from the existing Haveli, and you're just implementing how things were, and then you make a material choice of doing new construction with limestone and how the two correlate. But the way limestone construction is traditionally, everything is load bearing. We cannot do that everywhere. There has to be a combination of solid stone and cladding, right? And cladding was never done in tradition. In most cases, cladding was never done for stone construction traditionally in India. So how, cladding is a very Western concept of a tectonic way of putting a building together in multiple layers. So we have to do certain things because that's a way the general construction practice is, and it's easier to do it that way. It's easier to maintain it that way. But there are moments where we are able to infuse some of the learnings that we have from traditional. But I don't think we have a process. It's very messy right now. Like, it's a little bit all over, which is good in a way. We get to play with all these materials, but
no, because it wasn't simply about an adaptation or a preserving, but it's really about extending what these materials become. And so I was just wondering if if there is that whole meaning making aspect, because it's emerging from those typological studies as well, but also from looking at how that material then reworks and resettles and generates new form, etc.
Yeah, I think, we, for the overall form or the motifs that we are using, of course, there's a direct translation that we are working with some of these motifs and kind of imposing or providing continuity in those. But there are many cases that you're right, like it's a very new way of using a material, and how do you do that and sort of create, and for us, meaning is I have a 2-year-old daughter, and she says a lot of words that she doesn't know the meaning. And it's dangerous. So we are careful how we speak in the home. But that's a very interesting analogy, that she doesn't know the meaning, but she's repeating it. So meaning happens by association, by relationships, right? She will understand a word by associating it with something else. So we are trying to create some of these meanings by connecting with vernacular forms, by methods of making, labor. So there are multiple ways I feel meaning can be created, by methods of connecting with the ways of making with the labor, by ways of historical making in vernacular. I don't know.
No, that was good. I'll just ask if there are any questions from the audience. Yeah, PK has a question.
Hi. I mean, thanks for the talk. I had a question. I mean, a lot of the work that you show and the research that sort of goes into doing it, to me, it shows, and it's there in the diagrams that you do, which it's almost as if history is a set of lines that, traveling across places. And in that sense, a place itself sort of becomes this intersection which through these lines of histories are crisscrossing across. Most of the work tends to show that, be it Calcutta, be it Lumbini, any of those places. And I was wondering, if a place is not so much about being in place, but sort of set of lines that are passing through it. I was, and this is out of curiosity, is that when you move into thinking about architecture, there seems to be a focus on, what is local, or in that sense, sort of archaeology of what is that. And I was thinking, what travels, right? What travels in terms of, architectural language, form making, in terms of just the ideas? Because in that set of lines, what does an architect do if one is to think about a place not as something that is there, but is always about these lines passing through? So I was wondering that, if that is something that you think about. I know it's there in the the research that you do, but when it moves from that stage to thinking about actual sort of design making, or thinking about spatial thinking, how does that sort of connect to each other?
Good question. I hope I got the question. I'll try to summarize it. But architecture is mostly seen as a form of settlement, right? It's permanent, it's supposed to be there, but I think the underlying question sometimes is, how do you design for migration? How do you design for changes? Like, is that sort of things that are not set? Or
no, I'm saying that if you're yourself traveling to these places, right? What is it that, as an architect who's a traveler to these places, carries, right, to this? Like, and I ask this because there seems to be an insistence on thinking about what is there.
Yeah.
While the work is, like, the research shows about that everything has traveled, right? So as an architect, what is it that you carry with you when you're thinking about, like the architectural form, space, language, right? Because if it's like the intervention, a part of it is about, sort of thinking about the place, but it's also that we are, carrying lines with us, right? The work is about that. So you're traveling from New York, from Delhi, so what is it that travels with you to the place to, sort of shift the landscape a bit?
Yeah. No, I think I get it. So I would say that for me personally, after my undergrad in Delhi at SPA, I moved to Rome. That was my first job. I was there briefly, but then came back. But being in Delhi and being in Rome, I don't like Delhi much, other than the historic structures that are there in the city, or the greenery of the city. I think those are the two things that I like most. So I think this relationship with history from Delhi and Rome was set very early on. So appreciation for history is there. So that history could be anything. Like we are visiting, when we were visiting our site in Shahpur, we sat down with this guy who has been living on the land, taking care of the land for 20 years, right? So he is the history of the land. He knows more about the land than anyone else. So just talking to them. But when I come in, I think it's past 20 years of traveling and experiences. I think I would encourage everyone to travel a lot. I think that really changes you. It makes the whole world gray, the black and white world that we live in, that in opposition, one thing in opposition to the other, you see threads of continuity in languages, in traditions. So I think that's something I carry forward, which is hyper local but a gray world. That's not, I don't know. I don't know if I made justice to. But I mean, one other way of looking at it that I would say that what would you do if you were designing in the moon, right? If you're not having anything local, you're just getting everything from outside, including there's nothing there. What would the answer be? I mean, just as a provocation, I think that's something interesting to think, and that's where you see all these crazy forms people are proposing with Elon Musk, and they're creating shelters in the moon. But their things are detached from everything. But your question is more about, other than the place and the histories, what are you bringing in as an architect from your past memories or past experiences? Yeah, I guess I would say it's all the travels combined, like being in all these places and making friends in different places, knowing about different cultures. But then at the end of the day, you're not doing anything in Shekhawati that is influenced by Greece, right? You're doing something very local, but it just broadens sensibilities, I feel, just by traveling within India too. I traveled a lot with my family. We traveled to a different province every year. I think it's a Bengali thing. You travel once every year. And then, so for 18 years, we did that. And then after I went to architecture school, I did that outside India because we couldn't afford to go outside India when I was growing up. So I would say travel, if I have to summarize.
Huh? Yeah, I just wanted to know that why was the process of rusting accelerated in the the museum you were making? So basically, each material has its own time and the way of aging, and it shows its own story. So, what did you want to show the visitors by using the?
No, we didn't accelerate rusting for the museum. It was just for us to see, because we didn't have time. We didn't have time to wait 6 months to see a material rust. We wanted to see the contrast between weathered steel and a solid piece of steel. So that's the only reason we rusted it and placed them next to each other. So it's accelerated. So 6 months can be condensed in a day. And that it's a good point that it takes its own time, but when you accelerate it, you condense time, right? And you can see the difference and how that, but not for the actual museum. Yeah.
Thanks, Aurgho. That was, I mean, it's really moving to see this really experiential way in which you're thinking. And and also your interest in thinking of sort of processes that you know, exigencies of how architectural thought comes from certain kinds of colonial trajectories. And so in some ways I would also sort of push you to think of what does it mean to draw from, you know, where are some of the ways in which we draw come from, and then, you know, what would a decolonial drawing be in that sense, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
if one actually started thinking of a decolonial drawing, then would it take us away from certain ways in which standardization has come through, you know,
Yeah.
from a colonial process to a modern process to, you know, existing ways in which we live. And then if we, I mean, it also comes from some of work that we were doing. We curated this exhibition in Jaipur a few years ago, and we were looking at where the drawings of some of those, the Havelis that in Jaipur were never drawn in through a colonial, I mean, not never drawn through an orthographic way, right? But then we were saying, you know, how were they conceived? And I mean, what you spoke about was also that architects don't draw. I mean, architects don't build, but they draw, is what Robin Evans says as well, right? So a search to look at how those buildings were then conceived, what were the drawings that made those buildings, led us to the city archives, where we found these snippets of miniature paintings, you know, which became the buildings. These were notes to artisans. We do that in our classes as well. You know, we bring that up there. And so then the question is, and because that kind of drawing produced a kind of narrative architecture, you know, which was non-standard. It sort of produced a certain kind of way in which the body experienced space in different ways. The colonial ways of drawing, which is what Swinton Jacob brings to the drawing through the Jaipur portfolio, becomes a standardized process, you know, and then that actually allows the Indologists, you know, to then make Indian looking buildings with a European plan, and then a stylistic you know, motives that then get added. That's how the Indo-Saracenic and others are born, right? So the question is that, you know, do we then, and I know that there are exigencies, and you're doing a you know, hotel, there's certain kinds of, you know, 5-star hotels require certain kinds of build, you know, spaces and all of that. So then we land up creating that standardization, and then there's a language that comes out from you know, seeing things, and that actually also has a colonial trajectory, you know. So I'm just thinking that if and I know it's interesting to see that the practice is sort of building, which is why the provocation to the practice to like kind of think of what does it then mean to think, imagine a space through a decolonial drawing. You know, would that lead to another way of thinking of certain configurations of spaces, questions of life that get implicated in those spaces? So yeah, I mean, just a
No,
Yeah.
very. I mean, it's a very nice point. I feel we draw by the Western standard, by the UK and the US dominating the standards that have been set, from building codes to everything. And unfortunately, it has been embedded in the way buildings are built too. But I think different ways of drawing is a different way of observing and seeing the world too. The most decolonial drawing would be the most untrained drawing, you can say. Like my 2-year-old's drawing would be the most decolonial drawing that can exist, right? There is nothing being imposed about the way you can or should draw. But once we start training ourselves, so I think what I've seen through some of the things at sea is that I think there's an emphasis on not too much training on doing things a certain way. That, correct me if I'm wrong, like you are exposing students to other ways of drawing, other ways of looking at things. And I mean, in India, you have the Mughal paintings, you have the Potachitra in Bengal. You have different ways of drawing in different parts of the country. And that never made its way into current day architecture, right? They were used in developing architecture traditionally, like you correctly pointed. I know someone, she did her PhD on how the different guilds, construction guilds worked, and how was information translated as not as drawings, as written notes. You were giving a mason a building as a written set of notes, which is like specifications, current day specifications. You are not drawing anything. You mention a wall, and from the wall this much distance, you write out everything, and you write out what the wall is made of. But that was practiced in India. And then there are more artistic ways of drawing, which are the Mughal paintings. But then what the colonial way of building a building has done is completely detached it. And I feel, I mean, we would love to explore more of what it means to draw in a different way. But the thing is that that will have to be a parallel trajectory, right? Because the contractors will be reading a certain set of drawings, and we can work with consultants a certain way. But I think the value of that way of drawing still remains, because the value is in the way of thinking about space differently if you draw differently. And that's the value I see coming in, and also understanding how written notes were given as drawings to masons. But yeah, I think it's amazing. And for the hotel project, it's you bring up Indo-Saracenic, how there were all British plans. In our case, it's not a British plan, but it's a highly standardized set of requirements that Taj and all these groups work with. So you get to work with a plan. It's almost colonial, right? It's almost inserted from top, but then you try to, in a way, localize it to make it meet the requirements. Yeah.
No, it's also an adaptive reuse, but it's in a fort which has completely non-standard spaces. So you would be in like a room which is, like 2 stories high, or so this idea that experience can be different in different places. You don't have to have a standardized size of, say, a bedroom space and a toilet space, but learning from the way the narrative spaces were produced. Could that rethink the way we also design our own spaces in the contemporary?
Yeah, I think that there's a great, I think that certainly should be done. But again, I feel there needs to be a conscious effort in it. A lot of understanding of history, of how layout and planning worked in these. No, very nice point. Yeah.
Just expanding on the methods of drawing, but you were mentioning that now you're working a lot with the digital, and especially when you were showing that the virtual museum. And I was also looking at most of the projects that you've shown, like it's this geometry, then there's material, and then suddenly like there's a working of the detail, like it's a general way of working in architecture and in digital thinking digitally. So my question is that how does that thinking or drawing in digitally have shaped the process of the design flow? Like, yeah, you do start with a write-up, then you have a lot of sketches, but then we all tend to jump to the digital. But what kind of process or what kind of a thought process do you go into when you switch to the digital realm, and how has that affected your, let's say, the projects or the design thinking and so forth?
I think not much, I would say. I mean, I would like to believe not much, because at the end of the day, it's still a tool to an end. I feel the digital still remains similar to the way I would draw by hand. I would draft. We would train to draft by hand. But what I would say is that the things are set out. A lot of things are set outside the digital, and a lot of things are set within the digital world. Maybe 3 years down the line, we would love to have a large workshop where we could do a lot of material. We do material prototypes and mock-ups, but at the site and facilitated by the contractor. But if that could be done, like practices like Herzog de Meuron, they do that all the time. Like they build real mock-ups, one-to-one mock-ups when they are designing the building in the initial stages. I think that has a real physical sense of what the building would be. But in terms of what the digital has done to the process of design, I think it's a space for resolution of a lot of things, of refining things and of resolving things, but it's certainly not changed the way we think about design. We use the digital, but we are not influenced it in a way that certain firms have certain forms of form making, parametricism, Zaha Hadid or Patrick Schumacher's work, or there are some people in India also doing that kind of work. We stay away from that. We stay away from any digital ways of form making that looks cool, does not have any association to anything else. We try to come up with a strong idea from the beginning and then let it morph as we are resolving it. And the digital just happens to be a means by which we are resolving it. That's what I think, that's what I would like to believe, but maybe subconsciously there is some things that are happening with the digital that maybe I cannot define, but I would think there isn't much. It is a tool that we are using. Of course, there's digital tools that we use that would help us in doing daylight analysis and all of that, but it's not really. You can do daylight analysis manually too, right? So we treat it as a faster way of achieving a certain result.
Shift from the thinking with hand and the digital, and also most interestingly is the detail, working in detail, because when we are designing only through a perspective of detail, then we forget how the overall geometry of the building could turn up. Like if you're looking only through forces, then it could lead to other forms. But then you're playing very balancing what the geometry would be and what the detail would be. So I was just curious on where the digital helps you to make such certain decisions.
I think with detail, like I would say there are some influences of my past work life come in. Like I worked for extended period at SOM that heavily focuses on detail, although we don't design similar buildings. But that focus on detail still remains. We would sketch out details when we're doing concept design, not in construction document. And my partner, we are heavily focused on detailing the building because that's the only way to achieve. There's a saying, God lies in the details. But so we really look at detail as design, and there's a constant process of zooming in and out, like zooming in and out. If you don't do that, like you end up creating a building that you didn't know what was happening, right? And that can happen. And if you're happy with it, I feel we want to always know what the detail is, but when you zoom out, what does it do to the entire building? How does it turn a corner? How does it go into hit another wall? We want to know those conditions right from the get-go and figure out the material thicknesses, the material details, what are the materials available. We are starting to work with Snehalaya Trust for a tribal school and a health center. And for the health center, we are working with salvaged bricks. And for the other project, we are using these roof tiles. But we started looking at vendors even before we started designing. Because we wanted to know if the material is available that we are exploring. And we talked to the vendor, how they are fixing it and learning about the detail. We're doing it in week 1. I think that really helps in conjunction with conceptualizing.
Thanks. I think we'll take a couple more questions because now the floodgates have opened.
Hi, Aurgho. Nice presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to know about this one project, the process behind the project of this evolution of the design of the digital museum. So, what became the frameworks and logics behind designing a metaphysical space which tries to tell stories? And then that would become a very broad question, but then what role does material and scale play in the crafting of a digital space, the digital museum?
No, good question. So there, Francis Gehry designed a digital museum it's a museum for stolen objects for UNESCO. You should check it out. It's pretty fascinating. For us, I think one important thing was the digital space. We wanted it to be non-directional. So that's why we ended up, having a circle, and you're moving inside a circle and then entering and exiting at the center. And of course, although it is digital, there was a lot of play with hyper reality, works of James Turrell, the way he plays with light. He's an American artist you should look up. And I don't think, any architect, not many architects have been able to play with light the way James Turrell does, where you sometimes don't see the source of light. Sometimes you frame the sky, but you don't see the sun. You just see the sky and light coming in. So that was a big, deep influence. And then we wanted to be in a central space where you could see the images of the refugees, and you can click and read their interview or listen to them. So you almost need a gallery that doesn't end, and that only a circle is able to do it, right? Otherwise, it's very directional, which works for a physical space, but we felt having a circle that goes round and round made sense for a digital space. Yeah.
Thanks. It was very nice. And, you see the struggle of trying to inhabit the sublime as well as the ground, so it's kind of, and you try to do it with your drawings. I want to think with you on the journey of history, about your historical journey. And I mean, for architects, the historical journey becomes a genealogical journey. Where did the building come from? And then the question for the future becomes, where does it want to go from here? So I think that becomes the what happens with architects is that the historical journey kind of, terminates at the contemporary, and it becomes a museum. How about speculating, pushing it to, for the next step, or the next, phase in that genealogy? How does that type evolve? I think that will be a very useful kind of a trajectory in that historical journey. Because it's kind of like the types which held the migrants or the refugees. I mean, they or even the industrial types of the factories, or the port, or the port warehouses. Today they are there as holders of memory of all the. But what happens next? And what is their genealogical journey? What is the next step that takes? I think that jump will be very useful. And I mean, of course, like Wally said, there are imperatives of program and scope and client and all this. But even as a drawing exercise, that would be a very useful kind of a turn, probably, for your practice to kind of jump into.
No, very, very good point, Prasad. I like the point, and I think you are certainly right. You're looking at a building as a product, end in time. But we do try to think, I try to think in a way that you're almost looking at the building you're designing 1,000 years from now, when your building is a ruin and next to your building is a 2,000-year-old ruin, and next to your building is a 500-year-old ruin. So how can you stitch a story with those three ruins that belong from different periods in time? And I feel we need to be responsible to time, so that we can see our building as a ruin 1,000 years from now. And that would help, that frame of mind would help in answering your question, where you don't stop where you are. Like, think about how would the building be if you were to design it 100 years from now?
Ruin is a modern archaeological invention. You know, it's of this time of the modern archaeology. It doesn't exist before. Before archaeological studies, it doesn't exist. The idea of ruin doesn't exist. It kind of continues, grows, changes. It kind of becomes something else and stuff like that. So, because you spoke of typology, because you spoke of type and brought in the whole idea of type, type is not necessarily a monument, right? So it's kind of a generic form which emerges, which holds so many things with it. So then even like you said, like a fictional intervention would be a nice for us it's a joyful thing to kind of push the type into that, even in that fictional intervention. And then there is so much space today, I mean, in the digital via the non-physical spaces, there is so much possibility of exploration. So that's the only suggestion.
No, I think if I take it to typology that you are talking about, one thing could be like looking at the evolution of workspaces, looking at from a factory to a tech hub, like how has that evolved, and what will the future workplace be, where you're getting into a lot of uncertainty with AI. We don't know what a future of job is from 50 years, let alone maybe 10 years from now. But I think that's a very interesting speculation to do and see how that impacts architecture. The unfortunate thing is, in a lot of these conversations in Silicon Valley, architecture is not at all there. Like it's the place that's talking about the future without space. They're talking about time without space. And then you have some monuments being created by Foster, and then everyone jumps on that bandwagon. But I think just understanding how that type has evolved. We did a project in San Francisco. We converted a garage into an office for a foundation, where we looked into the type of the garage office that created all these San Francisco startups. And this was in San Francisco too. But this was for a foundation, not a startup company. But even that is a type, like a garage is a type that has changed. But I think it's a fascinating question. Maybe it should be a studio. Okay. Good. No, great question.
Last.
I mean, I was just wondering if one were to add just one last slide and think of a map of your practice, and think of the map of your practice as a series of layers, where one of the layers is the site where one is working with. Second is the research that one is doing. Third is the avenues of funding that are shaping these projects. Fourth is the program and the use of the program. And one kind of, if one builds this up as a map of practice, what is it telling us as a larger story of memory and meaning, in the sense that would this map tell us the story that memory is being used here as a tool that becomes a mode of consuming history within architecture? Does it go beyond that? Does it make an intervention into modes of meaning making that go beyond consumption? So just kind of to give you an example, many of the projects had funding that traverse across borders. Also, the projects were programs and had users that were meant for tourism. Many of the projects were also on tourism circuits. Okay, so what kind of larger story is this telling us about the role of history and how it is being deployed to create meaning?
Good question, Rohit. I would say that some of the projects, like if you're talking about how the projects are being materialized, of course it has to follow the flow of capital. Tourism circuits, how tourism circuits work. World Bank is funding a project, but then we did some work in Sundarban that is completely opposite to that, which is I'm just talking about how the projects are being materialized. A lot of them are high, hospitality projects with higher end hospitality groups, or tourism projects that are done with larger institutions like World Bank, or institutional projects for NGOs or INGOs, and then there are smaller NGOs that are there. And in each of these, we all know how the projects would get funded, right? But your question about in all of this, what role would memory play in creating a broader?
In making this map, I was trying to think about this question: where is the role of creativity, architectural creativity, in drawing upon archives and history to make a critical intervention? For instance, if colonialism and modernist spatial thinking were both thieves of memory, where is the critical intervention really being made through the use of archives in the making of space?
Got it. So I would say that when we are stepping into projects, there is a, as I was telling Apurva, there is a resistance to embrace newness. We want to create something that would provide a form of continuity. And for us, that form of continuity has been happening by these studies in memory or studies in history. And you rightly framed that memory is a tool through which you're accessing history, right? And that memory could be oral history projects, or it could be reading of architectural typologies from the past. And I think the role of creativity is to synthesize all of that into a project at the end of the day, because we do a lot of research that's without any end product, but most of these are projects that help us in doing the research, right? So at the end of the day, we know that we have to produce a building that has to meet a certain function. And the project is a means through which we do the research, use different avenues to come to a building. So synthesizing all of that within a framework in which modern buildings are built, right, is the biggest challenge, and also the room for room for creativity when you're trying to build something within the frameworks that are existing, but using things that are not so standard. I don't know if I helped answer your question. Maybe we can talk longer after the chat.
Okay, it's been a very robust round of questions, and I think I'd thank you, all of you, for being here. And of course, thank you so much, Aurgho, for the talk, and for taking us through looking at historical research as methods, and for Rupali for thinking of drawing as method, and for everyone who had a question, and for all of you for being here, of course. But just looking at how you produce new grammars for material, thinking of networked and embedded ways in which the architect works, and thinking of built form for the future as patiently assembled from these overlaid ways of thinking and working and crafting. So I'd like to call this talk to a close, and we'll see you at the next C Conversations, which is on the 7th of August. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.